seeing as this is a developer course, and I'm assuming you're probably a developer, you may well spend more time in Visual Studio than you do in SQL Server tools directly like Management Studio. The cool thing is that there are data tools built in to Visual Studio, and those data tools act the same way, behave the same way, essentially against an Azure SQL database as they do against an on-premises instance of SQL Server or against a SQL Server virtual machine that is hosted in the Azure environment. The experience and the differences in the experience are going to be pretty much the same concept as what we just talked about with your Management Studio. All right, so you can use, there's actually two different tools that allow you to interact directly with your Azure SQL database. The first is the Visual Studio Server Explorer. And you use Server Explorer to manage databases the same way, essentially the same way that you do in Management Studio. It's got a really nice query editor, and it's got some data preview tools that are helpful if you want to see changes and how those changes impact different elements of the SQL Server database that you've created. All right. Now, in addition to Visual Studio Server Explorer, you have a similar tool, and in fact, you'll see a lot of overlap between these two tools. You have the Visual Studio SQL Server Object Explorer. Now, the SQL Server Object Explorer is very similar to the Object Explorer that you'll find in Management Studio. And as I said, what you'll find in most cases is a lot of overlap between that and Server Explorer. Okay, but this does give you very much the same experience that you're going to have in Management Studio. And it's got the same kind of caveats that connecting to an Azure SQL database has within Management Studio. So for example, at least for now, you're using SQL authentication. Also, there's some other things that go a little deep into SQL Server. For example, you can't switch the database context by with a use statement, as if you're familiar with managing and interacting directly with SQL Server, you can do with an on-premises edition of SQL Server. But other than that, it's very similar. Oh, another thing that you will find is oftentimes if you're going to right-click, for example, and you want to, let's say, create something. Let's say you want to create a login or a user. Well, whereas if I'm connecting to an on-premises SQL Server, I'm going to get a nice little dialog box that's going to help me through the process, a little builder that'll help me through the process. With the Azure SQL database, when you do that, almost always, it's going to generate a script for you, and then you're going to have to use a script. That's okay because we're developers and we're fond of scripts, so that works out. So again, the story here is that you've got tools in Visual Studio, whether it's the Server Explorer or the Object Explorer, that are going to give you a very familiar experience in working with Azure SQL databases.